Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about something you've probably never seriously stopped to think about, even though it affects every one of us every single day. Out of everything we say, how much of it can actually be said clearly? That question makes most people uncomfortable, but don't rush to argue with me just yet. Just hear me out. Every day you talk. You share opinions with friends. You express feelings to your family. You argue online about politics, morality, identity, meaning. You even talk to yourself about life and purpose. But do you really think you've actually said those things? In the eyes of one very unusual philosopher, most of what we call talking doesn't really say anything at all. In fact, by his standard, most of the time we should probably just shut up. That philosopher is Ludwig Wittgenstein. You've probably seen his most famous line all over the place. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That line hits hard, right? It's like one slash of the knife and the whole conversation is dead. But what's even stronger is the sentence he gives in the preface. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak thereof one must be silent. Do you see what he did there? He raised the standard all the way to the ceiling. So now the real question becomes, what counts as something that can be said? And what counts as something that cannot? Because if you really use his standard to examine the things we care about most, the things we fight over, obsess over, build our lives around, questions like, what is good? What is the meaning of life? Is this painting beautiful? You run into a brutal result. They all get pushed into the zone of the unsayable. So in this video, we're going to do something that sounds a little arrogant. We're going to take this cold, sharp philosophical claim and break it down into something we can actually understand, something we can even play with as a thinking tool. And then we're going to do something even more reckless. For the fourth kind of thing Wittgenstein says cannot be spoken. That is, the boundary of language and logic itself. We are not only going to touch it, we're going to try to study it. How? The way this channel always does things, by building a model. The language you think you have may just be a misaligned map. Let's start with the simplest possible version of Wittgenstein's early thought, the core logic behind Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, the book that reads like some kind of philosophical operating system manual. Here's the easiest way to understand it. Language is like a map, but a map is never the same thing as the land it represents. So what is the world made of? For Wittgenstein, the world is made of facts. This happened. That didn't happen. All the combinations of what is and what is not. That's what makes up the world. And the job of language is to do something like drawing, to depict those facts. So if a sentence is going to count as meaningful, it has to correspond to a possible state of affairs in the world. And here's the crucial condition. A sentence must have a truth condition. In other words, you have to be able to imagine, under what conditions would this sentence be true? Under what conditions would it be false? Please remember this rule, because it becomes incredibly useful later. The sayable things we can judge as true or false. The unsayable things you can talk about forever, but can't clearly explain how they could ever be verified. The world of the sayable clear, but thin, so what belongs to the sayable? The answer is simple, almost cruelly simple. Only factual statements, scientific descriptions, claims that can, in principle, be tested. For example, the rain is hitting the window. The cover of this book is blue. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This clinical trial shows significant effects. These are things we can check. We can test them, verify them, compare them to reality, and decide whether they're true or false. In Wittgenstein's world, this is the proper workplace of language. This is what language is supposed to do. Clean logic, clear boundaries, sharp edges. But is that really where human life happens? Do we really live inside this thin strip of clearly testable facts? That's where things start to get interesting, and honestly a little unsettling. The vast and blurry territory of the unsayable for Wittgenstein. There is a huge domain of human life, exactly the domain where value, beauty, meaning, and depth live, that does not fit the model of factual description. If you try to force those things into the frame of factual language, what comes out is not deeper truth. It becomes, in his technical sense, nonsense. And no, nonsense here is not an insult. He doesn't mean stupid. He means you have stepped beyond the boundary of what language can meaningfully express. He divides this unsayable territory into 4 major types. First, ethics and value, things like people should be kind. This is absolutely the right thing to do. Life has meaning. Are these important? Of course they are. They may be the most important things of all. They are the foundation of civilization. They are the questions that come back at 2 a.m. when the room is dark and you can't lie to yourself. But can they be judged true or false the way we check the temperature of water? No. You can argue about them for 1,000 years and still not settle them. So for Wittgenstein, ethics is not something you can really say as a fact. It's something that must be shown. You can't prove kindness the way you prove a chemical reaction. You can only live it in concrete choices and let it appear in action. Second, aesthetics. This piece of music is beautiful. This painting feels sublime. This shot gave me goosebumps. These sentences define huge parts of human experience, but they also can't be measured like height and weight. Beauty is not an object sitting at coordinates in space. It belongs to that strange category of things that can't be fully said, only felt and shown. Third, metaphysics and the mysterious questions like, what is the essence of the world? Does God exist? Where does consciousness come from? You can ask these questions. Human beings always do. But if you try to catch them using the same kind of language you use to describe physical facts, it's like trying to catch moonlight with a fishing net. The harder you try, the more tangled you get. Because the thing you're trying to grasp is not within the range of factual language at all. Fourth, and this is the one we care about most today, logical form itself. This one is the key. It's not some thing in the world. It's the underlying structure that makes language possible in the first place. The framework that allows language to point at reality. It's like the grid behind the map, the coordinates, the scale, the invisible system that makes the picture legible. Wittgenstein says you cannot say this structure because if you try to use language, the map, to describe the structure of language, the grid of the map itself, you fall into an endless loop of self-reference. So he gives one of his most important distinctions. Some things cannot be said, they can only be shown. Logical form is one of those things. Every time we speak meaningfully, it is already there, silently showing itself. Reaching into the forbidden zone, can we study what cannot be said? So at this point, are we supposed to do what Wittgenstein recommends and remain silent before this fourth category, and maybe all the unsayable things with it? He draws a very clear boundary and basically tells us no road past this point. But the spirit of this channel has always been, if someone says, no road, that's exactly where we want to go take a look. So my answer is this: yes, we can study it, but only if we change methods. You can't study it by making straightforward factual statements about it. You can't use language like a key to unlock itself as if it were just another object. The method has to change. You have to treat it as a modeling problem. You can't simply state what the boundary of language is, but you can try to model how it works. You can decompose the mechanisms of language. You can propose hypothetical frameworks. You can define concepts and relations. You can see how far the model explains real linguistic phenomena, and where it fails, you revise it. That, on this channel, is what we call ontological modeling. And it's exactly here, when we start exploring how the boundary of language might be modeled, that I think our Chinese linguistic background gives us an extraordinary, almost unfairly good entry point. It's hidden in two characters most people never really look at: yi and yin. Now let me be clear, this is not something I'm claiming as a standard textbook conclusion in linguistics. This is a model hypothesis, a thought experiment. But it's interesting enough to pry open a completely new angle. Yu and yan, two layers inside what we lazily call language. In many Western languages, language is usually treated as a single symbolic system: words, sentences, grammar, logic, definitions. A self-contained structure. But in Chinese, what we call language is built out of yi and yen together. Now, translating yi is easy enough. It's close to what we usually mean by language as a symbolic system. But what exactly is yin? And this is where things get interesting. In Oracle bone script, yin is a much more primitive character. It's usually interpreted as an indicative sign, something like a tongue with a short mark above it. In other words, it points not just to what is said, but to something connected to the tongue, to the body, to the mechanism of speaking itself. Now, I have to say this bluntly, some modern explanations of this are honestly awful. You'll see people casually say, yen just means spoken words. But if that were all it meant, then why did the language need yi at all? Some people try to connect it to ye and say, well, that's just speech, talk. But ye clearly points to the act of speaking, the mouth, the act. Yen points somewhere else. It points toward the mechanism, and that mechanism is not primarily symbolic. It is bodily. It is tied to human physiology. And after long mother tongue training, it gets effectively locked into the body. That's exactly why I don't think English words like speech, talk, or even utterance are good enough. They point in the right direction, but not deep enough. So in this model, yen is not just speech. It is the way sound is physically produced, the structure of voice, the force mechanism, breath, rhythm, resonance, and the leakage of deeper states. Think of the phrase, 言为心声. Speech is the voice of the heart. If you interpret that only as content, it turns into motivational poster nonsense. But if you interpret it structurally, it becomes very cold and very sharp. The way your voice is physically formed cannot fully hide your deeper state. That's why 察言观色 was never just about listening to arguments. A real expert is listening for something else. How is this person's voice being made by the body? Where is the force coming from? Where does it weaken? Where does it suddenly burst? Where does it catch? Content can be disguised. You can be disguised. But yen is much harder to disguise cleanly all the way through. And suddenly this lines up with Wittgenstein's distinction. Yu is closer to what can be said. Yen is closer to what can only be shown. The deeper you move into yan, the closer you get to something that is hard to fully articulate, but deeply real. The baby example. First comes yan, then comes ya. Let me give you the most intuitive example possible: a baby. What can a newborn do? A newborn cannot speak. A newborn can only vocalize. The earliest sounds are things like or these are basically long vowel-like streams, continuous resonant rising and falling, hard consonantal cuts like B, D, G come later, and only after that does the child start learning words, sentences, concepts, grammar. In other words, entering the stage of making you. So in developmental order, a very important structure appears. Yan comes first. You comes later. That isn't mysticism. That's a fact you can observe every day. You said something earlier that I think is very important. When a baby can only produce yan, we don't even know whether it has full subjective consciousness yet, so that vocalization cannot be mixed with deliberate intention. Let me make that a little more scientifically stable. Early infant vocalization is driven much more by lower level neural systems, breathing, vocal cords, emotional circuits, reflex circuits. The systems responsible for planning, inhibition, strategy, and deliberate masking, like the prefrontal cortex and related executive functions, mature much later. So you can draw a very sharp but still defensible conclusion. The closer you get to the layer of yan, the less it looks like performance, and the more it looks like bottom, level state automatically expressing itself. That's why you can often hear through someone. A person says, "I'm fine." But you hear the tremble in the tail of the sound, the disrupted breath, the lifted placement, the sudden burst on one syllable, and you know they're forcing it. They don't need to confess it. Their yan already has. The truly weird part yan is learned, but not consciously controllable. Now we arrive at the point I think you really wanted to make. When you speak, are you more vowel-driven or consonant-driven? How much of your energy is allocated to vowels? How much to consonants? Where is your force peak? How does your trailing line move? That is not something you are born with. It is trained by your mother tongue, which means it is not a priori. It is acquired. It is shaped. It is a speaking operating system hardened through years of repetition. But then comes the strange part. It is not freely controlled by your later conscious mind. Try asking an adult to immediately change the ratio of force distributed across vowels and consonants, or to rebuild their prosodic structure, or to change the peak location of their voice. Very hard. You can imitate it briefly. But the moment you get nervous, relaxed, emotional, distracted, you fall right back into your native pattern. So it has a very strange nature. It's not innate. It's formed later, but it doesn't obey conscious will. It feels unintentional. And yet it is stable like railroad tracks. That is exactly the kind of thing that becomes very interesting inside a model of mind. Because it is not just knowledge you can memorize. It is not just an opinion you can swap out. It is more like a habit energy, a deep automatic program. And this is where Buddhism becomes useful. Yogasyu Ra. And the question of yan, is it manas? The Yoga school of Buddhism has a powerful framework, the 8 consciousnesses. I won't go too deep into technical doctrine. I'll only use the 3 layers you need today. The 6th consciousness, ordinary conscious mind. This is the layer that thinks, judges, analyzes. It likes concepts. It cuts the world into objects. The 7th consciousness, manas, or monasha. This is more like an ongoing self-clinging loop. It doesn't always sit on the surface, but it keeps whispering in the background. This is me. That is mine. I should be this way. I must not be that way. It is sticky. It is stubborn. It turns things into extensions of the self. The 8th consciousness I layer, Vijigin Na or Alayeshi. You can crudely think of it as a storehouse of seeds, habits, tendencies, impulses, dispositions, everything laid down and carried forward. So now your question becomes explosive. If yan is something formed later, yet not consciously controlled, unintentional yet stable, can it count as manas? That's a fantastic question because it forces us to stop using Buddhist terms as decorative mysticism and start treating them as functional modules. My answer is, yan itself is not the same as manas. Manas is the self-grasping loop. Its core is ego clinging. But yan may be one of the easiest outward channels through which manas and even deeper storehouse habits leak into the external world. Here's the cleaner version. Consciousness does the reasoning. Manas does the self-clinging, and layer stores the habits. And yan is the projection of these layers into the vocal system. You think you are speaking with consciousness. But in many cases, your yan is speaking your habits. That's why the more you try to pretend, the more likely you are to leak through yen. Because what you are masking is you. Content. What you can't fully mask is the breath, the peaks, the force path, the rhythm, the release. So now I want to propose something very bold. Can we insert a new layer between consciousness and manas? A layer I'll call yen consciousness. And I actually think this is a very good move for this channel, because that's exactly what ontological construction does. When the old framework no longer explains a phenomenon cleanly, you add an intermediate layer. Not to make things mysterious, but to make the explanation work better. So what would yan consciousness be? Here is a workable definition. Yan consciousness is the automatic interface through which subjective state, habitual tendency, and emotional energy are converted into audible vocal structure. It is not the language content you deliberately intend. It is the way the body's speaking mechanism reflects deeper states. In more scientific language, it is a channel connecting conscious mind and unconscious automatic systems, externalizing deeper states through breath, vocal cords, resonance, rhythm, and pitch. Now here's the fascinating possibility. Maybe the sages of Sanskrit civilization noticed this long before we did. Maybe all those traditions of chanting, mantra, recitation, and sacred sound are not superstition in the shallow sense at all. Maybe they are ways of training yan consciousness in reverse and, through it, reshaping the structure of habit itself, reaching downward toward the storehouse layer. Blue zone and red zone thinking. Too civilizational hand feels now we can take this yu-yan double interface model and extend it to a much larger scale. Here is a provocative hypothesis. Again, a model, not a verdict, for languages where consonant structure is more prominent, where architecture and definition matter more, where the symbolic side of language is sharply foregrounded. Let's call that the blue zone. Civilizations growing there may develop a certain natural hand, feel, in thought. They are more likely to objectify the world, conceptualize it, and build giant, internally coherent machines of thought. When you read Kant, when you read Hegel, that enormous hunger to wrap reason, will, and absolute spirit inside a grand logical system, you cannot say language alone caused it. But maybe, in those language interfaces, turning the world into something sayable, definable, systematizable feels especially natural. On the other hand, for cultures more sensitive to vowel continuity, tonal rhythm, and the layer of yan, let's call that the red zone. Civilizations there may preserve a more immediate intimacy with the unsayable. They may be more naturally attuned to forms of life and reality that resist being fully cut up by concepts and captured by logic. If I push the model into an extreme summary, it looks like this blue zone thinking is better at forging the sayable into highly precise systems. Red zone thinking is better at protecting and sensing the unsayable vibrations of reality. Two monster-level minds, Spinoza and Leibniz. Abstract theory is one thing, But if we want to put flesh and blood on this fork in the road, we need a pair of real people. So let's bring in two absolute monsters of 17th century philosophy, Spinoza and Leibniz. Both wanted to answer the most ultimate ontological questions. What is the world really? What is the relation between God and the world? What is freedom? And yet, with equally terrifying brains, they ran in almost opposite directions. Baruch Spinoza, 1632-16777, came from a very unusual background, and that background matters. If I had to summarize his origin in one sentence, I'd say he was born into a family of exilers and grew up to become one of the most radical and lonely philosophers of the modern world. His family carried the imprint of Portuguese language and culture. They were part of the Sephardic Jewish world of the Iberian Peninsula. After the expulsion from Spain in 1492, many Jews fled into Portugal. Spinoza's ancestors were part of that stream. And in Portugal, Portuguese became the language of daily life, memory, and continuity, even among those forced outwardly to convert while secretly preserving Jewish tradition. When persecution returned, Spinoza's parents carried those Portuguese language memories with them into Amsterdam. Inside the Portuguese Jewish community there, Portuguese was not just a practical language, it was a marker of identity, trade, religion, memory. Spinoza grew up inside that atmosphere. And here's the part I find fascinating in a Europe whose major languages mostly cluster closer to the blue side. Portuguese sits much closer to the red side. So, when we study Spinoza, it becomes very tempting to say his philosophical instincts often feel strangely close to certain Eastern forms of thought. Spinoza's doctrine is radical monism. His famous formula is God or nature. He takes God down from the position of a person standing above the universe and folds God back into the universe itself. For him, the world has only one infinite, eternal substance. Everything else is just a mode, a form, a modification of that one substance unfolding across time and space. The world runs according to strict necessity, like geometry. What we call free will is mostly an illusion produced by our ignorance of the causal network. For Spinoza, real freedom means seeing necessity clearly and living according to reason within it. That's a very cold, very wide, very whole vision. And in temperament, it feels surprisingly close to Eastern ideas of totality, to something like heaven and humanity as one, or the dissolution of ego into a larger order. Leibniz goes the other way. In 1646, in Leipzig, in the German-speaking world of the Holy Roman Empire, a child was born into a classic scholarly household, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. The Renaissance had already lit the torch of reason, and Leipzig, with its university and intellectual atmosphere, gave him a very different starting point from Spinoza. His father was a professor at the University of Leipzig. It was a textbook German academic family, discipline, books, structure, culture. German was clearly Leibniz's mother tongue, and it shaped him deeply. Leibniz's core metaphysical doctrine is monadology. For him, the ultimate components of reality are countless indivisible, non-extended, self-contained soul particles called monads. Each monad is like a room with no windows, its own tiny universe running on its own internal program. The interactions we think we see between things are not real exchanges at all, but part of a divine pre-established harmony, like an orchestra whose musicians never see each other, yet somehow remain perfectly synchronized. And Leibniz also insists that God selected this world from infinitely many possibilities as the best of all possible worlds. He is, in every sense, a rationalist and an optimist, an engineer of cosmic order. Two metaphysical instincts, two civilizational hand feels. These two giant intuitions are almost perfect illustrations of the model we've been sketching. Spinoza's world. one source, one substance, one network, necessity flowing through everything, feels like it comes naturally from a more red zone interface, continuous, resonant, holistic, indivisible. He feels like a master artisan not trying to cut a jewel into pieces, but trying to feel the uninterrupted grain of the jewel itself. Leibniz's world. Separate units, modular construction, rule-based composition, pre-programmed harmony, feels much more like a blue zone interface, architectural, structural, procedural, engineered. He feels like a great builder or programmer assembling a functioning palace from perfectly independent parts. Their lives mirrored their metaphysics. What makes the contrast even better is that it isn't just intellectual. It's biographical. Spinoza was almost the perfect image of the lonely philosophical exile. As a young man, he was declared a heretic by his Jewish community and subjected to a severe ban. He was permanently cut off from the world he was born into. After that, he survived by grinding lenses, supported by a small circle of friends, building his philosophical system in extreme isolation. His ideas were shocking. Most of his major works could not safely be published during his lifetime. He looks like someone who, willingly or unwillingly, peeled away all social identity and all communal noise and retreated into pure thought, listening for the echo of the whole universe. His life itself seems to show a movement away from Yao, social discourse, shared language, collective identity, and back towards something closer to Yan bare existence, direct encounter, solitary resonance. His life is a kind of loud philosophical ringing inside social silence. Leibniz's life, by contrast, is an entire concerto of European courts and institutions. He was not just a philosopher, he was a genius of practical action. Courtier, advisor, diplomat, librarian, historian, scientific organizer. He tried to found academies, designed actual machines, sent project proposals on science, economics, and politics, maintained one of the largest intellectual correspondence networks in Europe. He was a super project manager of civilization. His philosophy never left the organized social machine he lived inside. He tried to compile his ideas, epistemological, metaphysical, political, directly into the operational system of the world. His life is the perfect example of pushing the power of you, concepts, systems, rules into reality itself. So if I had to compress the contrast into two images, I'd say Spinoza seems to shut off the noise of civilization so he can hear the silent sound of the world itself. Leibniz seems to be the highest level systems engineer, trying to compile blueprints of thought into the machinery of society. Final thoughts silence and what we do instead. So now we return to Wittgenstein and to that wall called the Unsayable. Wittgenstein tells us, whatever can be said clearly must be said clearly, and whatever cannot be said clearly must be met with silence. What we did today was not an attempt to tear down that wall, and it was not an attempt to shout inside sacred territory. What we tried to do was light a few new lamps. We accept the dignity of the unsayable, but we are not satisfied with merely standing in silence before it. We choose to approach it as a research object, to get closer to it by building models, by sketching its outline, however faintly. The Chinese duet of yu and yan may be one of those lamps. It reminds us that language is not only a cold symbolic system, yi, yi, yu. It also has a living display layer, si, yent, a layer tied tightly to the body, to existence, to voice itself. And perhaps it is there that we come closest to those things that cannot be fully put into words, but are always trembling just beneath them. So maybe now we can understand more deeply why Eastern traditions have often treated the unsayable with humility and reverence. Why Western rational traditions have so often tried to turn everything into something sayable and systematizable. And why Spinoza and Leibniz, two titans of thought, starting from different kinds of natural hand, feel, could end up running toward such different destinies, one toward an indivisible unity with all things, the other toward the rational summit of designing a world in parts. Silence is one attitude, but exploration is one of the oldest human instincts. All right, that's enough for today. Thank you, everyone.